Good afternoon. I'm Kumar Ramakrishna, head of the International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism Research here at RSIS. Welcome to this second and final installment of a two-part webinar series on social movements, extremism, and violence, which will be delivered by my colleague, Dr. Irm Haleem. Uh, Irm is an assistant professor in the Strategic Studies program in RSIS. Her research and publications are interdisciplinary, focusing primarily on political philosophy, normative philosophy, and sociology. She is the author of the book, The Essence of Islamist Extremism, Recognition Through Violence, Freedom Through Death, published by Routledge. And she is the editor and contributing author of the book, Normalization of Violence, Conceptual Analysis and Reflections from Asia, also by Routledge. In fact, she's currently finishing another single-authored book with Routledge, Contradictions of Freedom, which is expected to be published next year. Now, in the first webinar in this series, Irm had previously introduced to us the concept of social movements, which is a very useful theoretical framework from a counterterrorism perspective. This is because violent extremists and terrorist networks do not just pop out of thin air. They're very often rooted in wider social movements that are fired by grievances against the status quo. Though, of course, not everybody in the wider movement is an extremist or, for that matter, a terrorist. To give you a bit more context, the sociologist Mark Juergensmeyer has made the point that violent fundamentalists like, for example, Yigal Amir, the killer of the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in 1995, and the Oklahoma City bomber Timothy McVeigh, who bombed the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building also in 1995, could never have emerged in a vacuum, but rather from a wider cultural milieu. Juergensmeyer employs the term culture of violence, while the psychoanalyst Willard Galen speaks of the culture of hatred from which such individuals like Amir and McVeigh emerged and imbibed their ideas and beliefs. According to Juergensmeyer, such cultures share the perception that their communities are under attack. Yet another scholar, Professor James W. Jones, has argued that understanding these cultures of violence is clearly a crucial part of understanding religious terrorism. So in short, whether you're talking about countercultures, cultures of violence, or social movements, this is an important topic for consideration by the counterterrorism community. With this backdrop, this afternoon, Irm will set out to clarify the meaning of the terms the left, left-leaning, far left, the right, right-leaning, and far right, as they appear in scholarly analysis and the narratives of the groups and movements themselves. She will be doing so through the prism of conceptual analysis and actual examples. I should add that today's focus on the far right as well is very timely, as we have seen a resurgence of violent far-right extremism in recent years, most notably, of course, the attacks in Christchurch in 2019 and other copycat attacks since then. But it's also important to underscore that there is a far left phenomenon as well, which is not often discussed. So what is the far left and the far right? How do they relate to each other? There's much to learn from this webinar, and I look forward to the discussion later. But before I begin, just a reminder that as per the usual practice, after Irm has completed her talk, please post your questions in the chat so that both Irm and myself as a moderator, and of course the other audience members can see them. So with that, Irm, over to you, please.
Thank you, Kumar, for that wonderful introduction. And let me just share the slides. Good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for being part of this. As Kumar has noted, we really look forward to your questions because that's really where it's all at, particularly in challenging anything that I say here. Before I start, I want to mention that the arguments that the analysis and arguments in this presentation are mine, and therefore cannot be reproduced without proper citation. And much of this presentation, if not all of it, is part of my ongoing book in progress under contract with Routledge. And so this is part of one of the chapters, also a part of an article that I'm in the process of writing. With that said, let me introduce the sections of the presentation. So there are 5 sections or parts, and I will keep it within 50 minutes. The first part is looking at the left and the right political spectrum. There seems to be a lot of ambiguity in terms of what it really is. And so here I'm going to be introducing the universal understanding of the left-right spectrum, and then the American understanding, and then my own rendition of the left-right spectrum, and how that makes sense to me, and how, and my own rendition is essentially what shapes my analysis in this presentation. The second part, I'm going to look at the similarities and differences between far left and far right. And here I'm going to look at differences, which are essentially in the aims, and similarities, which is in the methods. And as Kumar has noted, not much attention is paid to the far left. And I will offer an explanation of that in this presentation. There is a logical explanation, and it makes sense why. And I think it comes down to the differences between the far left and the far right. The third part goes into looking at far left closely. So I'm going to look here in 3 examples, time limitation, so I can't look at too many others. I'm going to look at the Antifa movement in the United States, the Black Panther movement in the United States, and then the Israeli Black Panther movement, which was a sort of a spin-off of the American far left violent Black Panther movement. So I think that's really interesting, which is in my previous presentation, I'd mentioned that movements are movements because they are transnational. Their appeal is transnational, and I think this is a great example of that. In part 4, I'm going to look at far right, and here I'm going to look at 2 specific examples, again, time limitations. So I'm going to look at what is meant by white nationalism in the United States. White nationalism is sometimes understood as as something short of a movement, but indeed it is a movement and therefore threatening, because it is resonates in the broader spectrum of the populace. And I'm going to discuss why and what are the components of that. And then I'm going to forward an argument, which is, in my view, Islamic State as a radical, violent, brutal indeed, a movement, and it's also, again, not a group, it's a movement because it resonates transnationally. I want to place Islamic State in the far right category. Now, often when we think of far right, we don't think radical Islamist entities. We place them wherever we place them, but not in the far right. And I'm going to argue that that's a mistake. It's a myopic way of understanding far right. So I think it really, I'll argue why Islamic State and for what reasons I place it under the far right category. In fact, this assumption is so universal that when we use the word far right as synonymous with white supremacists, and I'm going to argue that is inaccurate understanding of far right. And in the concluding remarks, a summary, I'm just going to reflect on the left-right spectrum based on what I've argued in this presentation, and then offer my analysis of common features that are found in all far left and far right entities. Before I start, also, I want to note that the focus in my presentation, it tends to be more American-centric for obvious reasons, but I do make references to others beyond the ones beyond Israeli Black Panthers and Islamic State. So, and this is where you might come in your Q&A. All right, so let's start with part 1, the left-right political spectrum. Now, here, I also forgot to mention that in each of the slides, you'll see a name underneath the title. So here, simple versions of left-right, and I've got David Boas, The Libertarian Mind. So this is where I'm deriving the information from. So according to Boas, grappling with the idea of the left-right, he argues that there's a simple understanding, which is the far left is communism, far right is fascism, and then you have liberalism and conservatism. In sort of liberalism, left of center, conservatism, right of center. But as you are probably thinking right now, that's really quite simplistic. Life doesn't work out that way. So then he offers a slightly more complicated version. Here he offers that we may complicate the left and the right, far left and the far right, or the left-right spectrum. We might understand it as most government on the far left, then that, according to him, coincides with what communism was. And at the far right, least government that he thinks coincides with fascism. And then liberalism, more government, and then conservatism, less governments. But there are obviously problems with even this spectrum, and Boas is also acknowledging that, although not offering a resolution for this. So in my view, these spectrums that he has put forth don't explain certain information and are inconsistent with reality and facts. So first of all, fascist governments, such as Hitler's Germany, were not premised on least government. I mean, if you look at the scale that I've placed above, they were not least government, but most government. In fact, totalitarianism, which of course means total control of not just the political element of society, but social, religious. Every element of society is what the Nazis controlled and essentially gave rise to the study of totalitarianism as a political system. So there again, that's one point striking to me that makes this simplistic version irrelevant for our realities. The second is that contemporary conservative states, such as Singapore, are not based on less government. Now, here, I just want to note, I'm not comparing Hitler's Germany with Singapore. I just want to make that point. I'm just saying conservative states, and there are many conservative states. Arab states are conservative states. Saudi Arabia, I think it's more conservative than Singapore, and so on and so forth. But conservative states, I mentioned Singapore because I live in Singapore, and we have a Singapore context here, but conservative states, according to this Boas's spectrum, coincide with less government. And again, that is not true. Conservative governments place their emphasis on order and security, which are important concerns, but they cannot be undertaken with less government. They need to have more government involvement. That's the only way that can happen. In the US also, the far right talks about less government. So maybe you can say, all right, and to that extent, this spectrum is good, but also the necessity of order and hierarchy, which cannot be realized without authoritarianism and therefore more government. Here is my view, and it's not just this particular point is not exclusively my view, but the American far right is essentially, if you scratch the surface, is essentially vying for an authoritarian system. It's challenging the democratic system that the United States has, and if it's not checked, that would be a big threat. I mean, right now we have Biden as president, so we're okay for now. All right, so these are, and you might find some other problematics with this simplistic version of far left, far right, but here are the ones that were striking to me. So I'm going to offer what I consider as a more accurate version of the left-right. And here's what I see. I see the middle as moderate, and then liberalism as left of center or left-leaning, conservatism as right of center or right-leaning, and then you have leftist parties that are not violent, but they're more leftist. You know, what in the American context, Bernie Sanders propositions are definitely leftist propositions. And then you have ultra-conservative right-wing parties. Again, this is interesting because right-wing parties in the United States, and I'm sure this is applicable anywhere else, are hierarchical, they're exclusionary, but they are not necessarily arguing for the use of violence, but they also don't condemn violence. And that's the difference between the leftists and the ultra-conservative that are not on the far left or far right. So then far left, you have the far left that advocate violence, far right. So here, again, I'm going to place the differentiation as far left are essentially revolutionary parties. Far right are more parties that are interested in totalitarianism. The distinction I see between the two is revolution, at least in theory, has this sort of warm and fuzzy element to it, because in theory, and I'm emphasizing theory because that's not how it has always manifested itself. It's supposed to, revolution in some theoretical analysis is considered as radical liberalism. And why? Because the premise of revolution is justice. The premise of revolution is equality. Most revolutions, even if you look at the Russian Revolution, or rather, if even if the rhetoric is different, the revolution, the impetus of revolution is always justice, a better way of living, not hierarchy and not supremacy, which is why revolutions succeed when they succeed, which is very different from totalitarianism, which is an unapologetic supporter of hierarchy, social, racial, socioeconomic, and so forth. The leftists may be supportive of anarchy, which doesn't mean violence. It means change, even if through some disorder. Ultra-conservative, definitely more concerned with control. The radical left also are reactionary. They are reacting to what they think is a system that needs to be changed. And the idea is to change the existing system. The far right are also reactionary, but they are reacting to too much change in the system. And what they want is to maintain the historical order. Now, I've put historical in italics because when, as you'll see in my discussion in this presentation, they're not looking for so let's, for example, the American far right, it's not really looking to maintain the order of the liberal order in the United States. When it wants order, what it's really maintaining order, what it really wants is the glory yesteryears of white supremacy, unapologetic white supremacy and slavery, and so what Trump used to call, the reaction against political correctness. And by the way, that's a loaded expression, and I'll get back to that. Here on the far left, you also have, it's defined by focus on equality, as I mentioned already. Far right, focus on order. Here, equality at all costs, even that of violence, order at all costs, even that of violence. Now I'm going to offer just to compare contrast. Now this bottom spectrum is my rendition of what might apply universally. So for the United States, how does that apply? Well, in the United States, you have, again, moderate center, liberal left-leaning, and right-leaning, conservative right-leaning, radical left, radical right. Now in this category, you have, in the moderate center, I would put Biden there. It's bipartisan. It's defined by bipartisanism. So in other words, not Democrat, not Republican, but a kind of a consensus. It's moderate politics in the United States is based on a consensus, or intended to anyway. Liberals are less about consensus. I'm arguing more about social welfare policies. And here, and the conservative right-leaning are more about no handout policies. The conservatives in the United States, the right-leaning conservatives, are very much in opposition to any kind of increase in welfare policies, unemployment policies, and the like. And you have on the far left and the American far left, anti-right, by that I mean anti-right-wing and anti-fascist. And far right, you have anti-immigration, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, those entities that fit in there. Notice I haven't put here revolutionary because we're not, thankfully, there yet, or totalitarianism. So we can understand the center as progressivism. We can understand liberalism as internationalism, right, conservative, right-leaning as patriotism. Patriotism, as George Keita, Professor Emeritus, Princeton, argues. There's a book that I urge those of you that are interested to look at it. It's called Patriotism and Other Mistakes. And he makes a profound argument for the reasons why he considers patriotism, intense patriotism, to be a threat to the integrity of any country, particularly the United States. Communitarianism on the far left, and an anarchical vigilante justice, and I'll talk about how that reflects Antifa in the United States, and nativism on the far right, I'll explain what that means later in the presentation. And anarchical too, by the way, but justified with rhetoric such as live free or die. Now, I don't know how many of you have noticed, if you look at the many images that we get from the United States of the far right, the right and the far right, what's striking to me is that they carry banners that are very emotional, particularly in the American context. Live free or die was the philosophy of the American Revolution, and then it's actually it resonates with the American the context. It is very much used to be a support for democracy, liberalism, equality, rights for all. But the far right are using it as a justification for their exclusionary politics, and in my analysis, this is intended to mobilize those that might be a little bit apprehensive to join far-right policies that are, if you look at their speeches, they're hostile. So I'll get more into that. Now, here is where I think this category of liberalism and moderate center is really where liberal democracy in the United States lies. The conservative right-leaning is really vying for illiberal democracy, which I define the difference between the two are that liberal democracy is inclusive. It does not determine rights based on race, religion, ethnicity, and illiberal democracy does. In many different ways. I can't go into that too much right now, but I'd be happy to answer questions because, again, that's part of what I analyze in detail in my book in progress. And then here you have the category, again, as I mentioned, anti-immigration, anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim, anti-LGBTQ, and anti-abortion, anti-same-sex marriage. And here, essentially, this is the category that is particularly threatening for the United States because it is really rooting for undemocratic system, although it will never actually say that in its rhetoric. In fact, it does the opposite. It uses narratives such as live free or die. All right, so that's just an overview of what I see as the categories. And then let's go into looking at the differences between far left and far right. Now, these slides on similarities and differences, I am drawing on Herbert McCloskey's and Dennis Chong's article. And so if you're interested, you can look that up. So now, what are the similarities? Well, McCloskey and Chong say that here are the similarities. Both far left and far right have a hostility toward existing institutions, but for different reasons. Both are intolerant of dissenting views, but for different reasons. Now, it may be interesting that to think of far left as intolerant of dissenting views. I mean, we understand far right to be that, but I'll explain why that is so. They're intolerant of ambiguity, according to these authors. Ambiguity, this is interesting because, I mean, how do we understand ambiguity? Well, McCloskey and Chong argue that the far left and far right are really looking for answers now, not sometime in the future. And ambiguity, we'll get there at some point, is threatening, which is, by the way, also another reason why they promote violence as a way to move things along faster. Both of them are dissatisfied with the status quo. That seems logical, but for different reasons. The we the people rhetorical logic is used by both the far left and the far right. And I think that's interesting because we the people, in the American context, we the people, that's how the US Constitution starts, we the people. It's a very emotional reference. It is I think, at once a very liberal, inclusive, and democratic reference in the United States. So in other words, we, the people, does not distinguish between race, ethnicity, religion, gender. It is American, we the people, we are all equal. So what's interesting is we the people implies equality in terms of rights and freedoms. far right uses this rhetoric ironically, but so does the far left, not so ironically. Both of them focus on have similar repertoires and emphasis on violence as means to an end. Now, I've mentioned repertoires in my presentation a month ago in social movement theory. Repertoires are essentially tools that social movements use in order to attract attention, in order to give rise to a sense of camaraderie, and to give a sense of the morality of their cause. Now here, emblems, flags, use of terror and terrorism also is repertoire. In my previous presentation, I'd mentioned that for Islamic State, the beheadings became a repertoire. The idea of that was to instill terror. The message was, if you don't, you're with us or against us, or you get your head chopped off. Suspicion of other, now this is something I'm adding new here as a repertoire. And then sharp in-group and out-group tactics. And finally, McCloskey and Chong argue that both these far left, far right are repressive. They, quote, they relying on systematic coercion, surveillance, ruthless enforcement of control. And I think this can be seen definitely in Stalin's Soviet Union, far left, and Hitler's Nazi Germany, far right. It's odd to think of, when I think of far left, Stalin doesn't come to mind, but the fact is that is a fact, and just proves the point that far left is not really, they're not any nice people any more than the far right. They're just different ideology, different aims. So here are the differences. Apologies for just putting all the information here the best way I could do it. So let me just go through that. Let's go through the topics. I'm going to go systematically. So number one, hostility toward existing institutions. Now, far left understands the hostility. The hostility to them is that they see existing institutions as pawns for the rich and corrupt politicians. And they argue that media serves the rich. Far right see the existing institutions as pawns for liberals and leftists. And again, they also see the media as serving the liberals. Side note, this is something we heard constantly from the Trump administration when during Trump years. Fake news was really a way to create smoke screens for information that was factual in order to deflect what was really going on, deflect attention from their own wrongdoings and this narrative of fake news was really quite effective. And again, their narrative was it's liberals are against the Republicans. Point two, intolerance of ambiguity. Well, the far left thinks it encourages dehumanization and exploitative behavior. Now that on its own sounds something that I think would appeal to most of us to make sure that there is some kind of a check on exploitative behavior. It's the means of the far left that become problematic because they're violent. The far right doesn't like ambiguity because it thinks it encourages immorality and anarchy, which again is ironic because their agenda itself is hierarchical, which I would argue is immoral and can give rise and does give rise to anarchy in reaction. Number three, dissatisfaction with status quo. Far left thinks there's need for more welfare policies. Far right thinks more police, more military establishment. The problem with more police in the American context is that there is, as with any institutions, you have people that maybe, recruits that are coming in with their own racist, fascist, neo-Nazi ideas. When they put them in the position of being a police, that's what leads to, in the analysis of many, the brutality and targeting of Black Americans and other non-white Americans. Number four, we the people rhetoric. For the far left, it means equality by any means. For the far right, it means order by any means. Notice the difference here. And again, this is McCloskey and Dennis Chong's framework. Number five, ultimate aim. Well, what for far left is change in existing political and social order, change to new, more equitable system. Now here, I'm adding here, McCloskey and Chong don't refer to this, but I see that as norm eroding. So it's eroding. Norm eroding is, for those of you that may not be familiar, norm eroding policies or norm eroding movements are movements that democracy is essentially norm eroding. In other words, democracy based on the fact that it's representation and equality for all means that when there is a imbalance of that, you want to change that in order to make it more equitable, and that is eroding the norms, norm eroding. Norm preserving, now coming to far right, ultimate aim is there to revive historical and political and social order, go back to the glory yesteryears, and that's I'm placing here norm preserving. Now that's interesting because it can be a little bit confusing. Am I suggesting that the far right, in let's say the white supremacists in the United States, they want, what does that mean? That norm preserving, they want to preserve liberalism and democracy? No, norm preserving, norms that they want to preserve are really historical norms. And often, in fact, the Confederate flag, for example, is not only a flag that symbolizes anti-civil rights movement, but it glorifies slavery. So social movement theorists will argue that a lot is said in emblems and flags that is not said in words. And it's important to understand the meaning and the metaphors that are implicit in these gestures. And that's what it is for the American far right. Now I'm going to go into a close-up of the far left, looking at the far left entities. Here I'm going to look at the universal demands of the far left, and which is going to reveal itself through the examples that I look at. So I'm going to look at Antifa, United States, Black Panther movement, US, Israeli Black Panther, and I've actually mentioned Al-Qaeda here, but I'm not going to discuss that for time interest, but we can discuss that in our Q&A. The pictures here, I think, are interesting. What's very interesting to me, if you took a look at top left, that's the Israeli Black Panther. So it has in Hebrew, the word Black Panther's way, and then Arabic, and then English. If you look at the middle of the picture, that's American Black Panther, comprised of Black Americans that came about in the 1970s, and the middle and the top right. It's really interesting to me that something, this is what makes it a movement. The ideas resonated as far out as Israel. And at the bottom, you see Antifa, and their premise, and the reason why they become popular is that their notion is attractive to many, which is it is anti-Nazi. If you look at the picture on the bottom left, you see that most of the Antifa appear to be white Americans. And in fact, that is the demographic of Antifa. Predominantly white Americans, predominantly educated, college educated, and ages from 20s all the way to 40s and 50s. All right, I'm going to look at Antifa first, ideas and notions, and this is the emblem here on the right. Now, Antifa can be distinguished into two categories. It has two branches, if you may. It has a leftist branch. Notice I mentioned that that's not one that promotes violence, and it has the far left branch. Now, the leftist branch is non-militant, non-violent tactics, and the far right, which is what we usually hear in the news, is militant, violent tactics. Now, the far left, the left non-militant tactics component of Antifa is concerned with information gathering, intelligence, educating public about fascism and its consequences, public shaming of fascists and neo-Nazis in rallies, and distributing leaflets. The far right is the far left of Antifa, the militant component of Antifa, is concerned with the disruption of fascist rallies through violence if necessary. I don't know if any of you noticed that when President Trump got elected, there was a lot of far right and far left clashes that are, you can look them up in YouTube, and you see a lot of violence promoted and preempted by Antifa against the far right in order to disrupt the rallies. Confronting fascists, there was this hashtag that was going around that time that said punch a fascist a day, which is problematic because it's promoting violence. And one could argue that how is this in essence so different from the far right, because both of them are promoting violence. All right, grievances. What are the grievances of Antifa? Well, rise of xenophobia, fascist neo-Nazi movements, destroying American liberal democracy. That's their grievance. And that, by the way, is also how they get their recruitment, because this appeals to the sentiments of the Americans. The second grievance is essentially far right, is its intimidating tactics are essentially making the populace comply, be passively compliant because they're afraid of their own safety. And this essentially introduces terror in American society. Government is not doing enough to counter far-right terrorism. So Antifa far left element argues that we will take matters in our own hands. What are the methods for the far left contingent of Antifa? Well, violence as repertoire, violence indeed intended to increase the opportunity cost for fascists, neo-Nazis to hold rallies. Now, I think that's really interesting. Just like the far right intimidates the populace to basically shut up their dissent and opposition to them because they instill terror and aggression, the far left Antifa is trying to do the same thing. The idea is if we attack the fascists and neo-Nazis, they'll think twice before organizing rallies. Violence employed to get media attention, this I think is interesting, and to further advertise the rising threat of fascism and neo-Nazism in the United States. Violence used to deter the formation of further or future fascist neo-Nazi groups and movements. And most importantly, and this is my analysis, the rest of it is analysis taken from the source I've mentioned up top here, but this dialectical logic is my particular analysis here. I think essentially their method is dialectical. In other words, challenging the fascist neo-Nazis' proclaimed supremacy by using violence and terror against them, using their own tools against them, and by terrorizing them in return through use of violence. Now, I think this is really interesting, and I'll talk more about it toward the end. Dialectical logic, I argue, is the defining feature of all far left entities. Now let's look at the Black Panther Party in the United States. Now, the Black Panther Party stroke movement, why am I saying that? Because it was a party that was a product of a movement, and the movement that it was a product of was civil rights movement, started in 1954 all the way to 1968, although I think you can, civil rights movement is essentially still ongoing, and I'll explain why. So you can understand civil rights movement as having both nonviolent and violent components. So the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, 1909, created in 1909, and it's still present today, is a nonviolent association, organization in order to increase awareness of discrimination, far right attacks, intimidation, terror. And it's very much a part of civil rights movement. Then you have Black Lives Matter movement, started in 1914 through the shooting of a Black teenager and the person who shot him being acquitted, and then subsequently police violence against Black teenagers and Black men. It's very much active, and what's interesting about Black Lives Matter, it's primarily nonviolent, but it has certainly had violent elements, which is, I think, interesting how nonviolent movements can become violent. And then you have the Black Panther Party, which was a product of the civil rights movement. And it was a product of what this is, you can understand it as a splinter party, splinter of civil rights movement. Black Party members thought that civil rights movement was not doing enough, was too soft on the authorities, and this wasn't really getting the things done. Blacks were still suffering from all the things they were suffering before the civil rights movement came into being. So they believed that the way to change things is to introduce violence. So it comes very neatly in the category of violent far left movement. Here's the emblem. And what are the grievances? Poor education, unemployment, unacceptable housing for Blacks, American white supremacy, and American imperialism. Interesting, because this is where Black Panther Party got international support. Imperialism is something that resonates with the less developed countries at the time that were disgruntled or might have been disgruntled by what they perceived as American imperialism. Has trampled on the human rights and dignity of Blacks. Blacks as targets of police brutality, targeting of Blacks, devaluing of Black lives. And I think this is interesting because nothing has changed in terms of that. This is Black Panther Party grievances. In 1966, these are the same grievances you have as laid out in Black Lives Matter. Incidentally, the reason I'm not analyzing Black Lives Matter in detail, because it is primarily a nonviolent organization, movement, sorry, it's not an organization. So that's why I have decided not to add that. But I think that's really a sad irony or a sad fact here. What are the methods? Violence is freedom. This was the rhetoric of Black Panther Party, that freedom can only be gained through violence. And so therefore violence is moral. Repertoire was guns, leather jacket, and black beret. Now this may seem somehow somewhat trivial, but this was the way their idea was to not blend in society, not to go underground, but to be, as we say in the United States, be in your face, quote unquote, to be visible, to be the entity that is feared, as opposed to the white supremacists that the Black Americans feared at the time. So it's a counter to that. Again, dialectical logic. Here, the Black Panthers started using the word pigs to refer to oppressors and to refer to them as uncivilized, and not the other way around. Now, the Black Panthers got this inspiration from Frantz Fanon's book, The Wretched of the Earth, where Fanon is talking about the French imperialism and racism in Algeria. And here, Fanon was talking about how the French referred to the Algerians as pigs, as animals, as subhuman, other entities referred to as subhuman. And the Black Panthers turn the logic around and argue, why are the oppressed the pigs? How about we use this reference to refer to the oppressor? And therefore, dialectical logic, in my view, this is very much essentially Hegelian master-slave dialectical logic. It challenges the moral superiority of the police by calling them pigs, as opposed to having them dehumanize Black Americans. Is essentially changing the narrative and turning things around and arguing essentially from the Hegelian master-slave dialectic, that challenging who is the master and who is the slave, essentially a slave in metaphorical terms, the slave challenging the master's supremacy. Now, Israeli Black Panther movement. Now, the Israeli Black Panther movement started in 1971 and essentially ended in 1977. Now, this movement was for Mizrahi Sephardi Jews, that is Moroccan, Algerian, and Iranian Jews. The grievances, what are the grievances? Mizrahi Sephardi Jews are discriminated in European-dominated Israel. Now in 1948, when Israel was created, understandably, this is right after, a few years after Nazi Germany lost the war, many of the survivors of the Holocaust immigrated to Israel. Some of them went to the United States, Europe, and elsewhere. So interestingly, most of the governing entities of the new state of Israel were European Jews. So the Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews felt that they were discriminated. The other grievance was the Mizrahi Sephardi Jews often disqualified from Israeli defense force as marker of status in society. Government favors Soviet Jewish immigration to Mizrahi Sephardi immigration. That was a big contention. Sorry about the sequence here. The Mizrahi Sephardi Jews the other agreements was they were placed in transition camps when they arrived in Israel after Israel was created, while Ashkenazi European immigrants were given preferred housing. and Mizrahi Sephardi Jews absent from politics and higher education and public education. And these are the grievances, and they were real grievances at the time. Methods: adopting the name American Black Panthers to cause alarm among political elite and government to get attention and recognition. Now, what's important to understand is that the Israeli Black Panthers did not really have any connections with the American Black Panthers, but they liked the sentiment, they liked the ideology of resistance against injustices. And then adopting the name was to alarm political elite. Demonstrations, riots, hunger strikes were repertoires, were methods and repertoires. What was the outcome? This outcome is really interesting here. The Israeli Arabs wars reduced the popularity of movement premised on domestic conflict. 1971, you have the beginning of the multiple wars, Arab-Israeli wars. So that didn't bode well for the Israeli Black Panthers. In 1977, this is also very interesting, the Israeli Black Panthers joined the right-leaning Likud party with Prime Minister Menachem Begin's victory. Now, I think this is really interesting because you have in essence, a far left movement that when it doesn't gain the attention because of Arab-Israeli wars, decides to get recognition by joining a right-leaning party, complete contradiction of their essence and sentiments. Even more interesting is that some Black Panthers later joined far-right religious Shas party in Knesset and are still members of that. This is something we can discuss in the Q&A, but what I can say here is that what this contradiction illustrates is that the motivation, the driving motivation of far right and far left is to get attention, to get recognition, to be heard. And the actual ideology or the methods or the grievances stay the same, but the actual ideology can be fluid. The Black Panthers, the Israeli Black Panthers, found recognition with the Likud party and then the Shas party. All right, moving on to the second last part, the far right, close up. The images that I've selected here are interesting to me. The top left image is the image of an individual arrested after the January 2021 riots on the Capitol. The middle picture illustrates that, and this individual in the middle picture is carrying the Confederate flag. The symbolism behind that is we don't want equality, we don't want liberal democracy, we want hierarchy, we want racism, institutionalized racism. The Black Lives Matter movement has inflamed the far right even more. The individual on the top is posing as Hitler. He apparently argues that Hitler is his hero. The bottom picture is Ku Klux Klan, and again, different neo-Nazi flags at the back. And the bottom and the further bottom left is ISIS. Here, I'm going to argue, as I noted, that Islamic State should come under the far right category, and I'll explain why. The middle bottom picture, I think, is interesting because it is taken from an article written about how far right has a sort of, rather the jihadis, the far, in this case, the Black Hood, motivates the far right to, well, it motivates their fear. It increases their fear and makes them more active, and it's a reciprocal extremism that ends up happening. But what I also see interesting about this picture, in my view, is that both these jihadis, the radical Islamists and the white supremacists are essentially, in my view, and come under the same category of far right. All right. This, I wanted to place this picture here, just I want you to appreciate this. This is from March 25th, 2021 issue of the Harvard Crimson magazine. So the title is Crimson Clan. This is photo taken in 1924. These are Harvard graduates, and they are unapologetically posing in 1924 as supporters of neo-Nazi Ku Klux Klan. The reason why I think this is interesting is any one of you that have been to Harvard campus will know that this John Harvard statue is central to the campus. And it's quite disturbing when you look at it, because it is a normalization at the time of supremacy. It again, so some of it is still normalized in other ways, but not quite this way. All right, categories of right and far right extremism. Here, I'm going to look at the white nationalism. So white nationalism in the United States. Now, there are three elements of white nationalism in the United States: racial extremism, nativist extremism, and anti-government extremism. Racial is based on white supremacy, nativist based on anti-foreign, anti-immigration, and anti-government distrust of government. Racial considers Jews as non-whites. Interesting, because that's what Hitler's regime also believed, because they believed that race was defined in terms of religion, not the color of your skin, and considers non-white individuals as inferior. Nativists consider individuals other than Americans or immigrants, other than non-Christian, non-Judeo-Christian, as threatening to American life, as un-American. And anti-government believes in the notion of sovereign citizen. Now, the sovereign citizen movement is a movement that makes a couple of arguments. One of the arguments it makes is that citizens are sovereign. They don't need the government to institute laws for order. We can take care of ourselves. We have our guns. The other element of sovereign citizens movement is that it argues that the authentic Americans are white Christian Americans, and nobody else. And it's their way of interpreting, is their perverted way of interpreting the American Constitution. The racist extremism thinks outsiders, non-whites, can never be insiders. The nativists think that outsiders, foreign or non-Christian Americans, can become insiders if they reject their religion and adopt the American way of life, which is really interesting, because they allow it. To me, it makes them perhaps a little bit more negotiable, open to negotiation, perhaps, I don't know. Although it's problematic to expect someone to reject their religion, because religion is identity. The anti-government are interestingly anti-racial, radical Islam, and anti-illegal immigration. Now, you might ask yourself, well, where did that come from? Well, it's part of the distrust of government. They believe that government has allowed illegal immigration, hasn't been tough on it, and it's because of the government incompetence that we have. We had 9/11, and we still face, according to them, threat of radical Islam. Examples: neo-Nazi, KKK, neo-Nazi groups. The Tea Party movement is part of a nativist extremism. Now, Tea Party movement is something that we don't really hear about outside of the United States. The Tea Party movement was created in 2008. It was actually created as a reaction to the election of a Black American president, President Obama. And it is started as a conservative party, but then turned into a movement that has many different contingents. It has conservative, ultra-conservative, right-wing, and far-right elements. So now the Tea Party movement is based on essentially the idea of a rejection of immigration and anti-foreign, and an emphasis on American and Americanism. But again, as you can understand, that became an umbrella for other far-right movements. Oath Keepers and QAnon, amongst others, are anti-government. But what's interesting here is Oath Keepers are anti-government, but they also double up as other kinds of racism. And this is where I'm going to borrow from Jackson's, the diagram in here is borrowed from Jackson's article. The red part is where I add the addition. So according to Jackson, racist, anti-government, and nativist elements overlap. So just because you're nativist doesn't mean you don't have elements of racism and you're not anti-government. There's an overlap. And I have added here vigilante justice as also a component that Jackson doesn't mention. Now, another way to understand the far right is, let's understand it in terms of an umbrella, the alt-right, now AltAmerica. Now, again, we don't hear much about AltAmerica. AltAmerica is alternative America. And I've placed the Tea Party movement here. And Alternative America, it's a movement that argues that there's the mainstream America that most of the world knows about, democracy, liberalism, and then there's a counterpart, which is Alternative America, and we need to be heard. And what are their demands? Well, Obama, their views, and this is the Tea Party movement views as well. Obama is a Muslim terrorist, wants to impose Sharia. Politicians are corrupt. Climate change is hoax. Gun control is really intended to impose imperial authoritarianism on Americans. Biden's government is illegal, which, by the way, explains January 2021 riots. Suppression of white people and injustice against them is a larger problem than suppression of Blacks or other minorities. This, by the way, is interesting because what the grievance really is not a suppression of white people in terms of police targeting white people, but it's really what it's saying is we are losing our privilege, our unbridled privilege, and they see that as a suppression. Blacks and illegal immigrants are a weight on taxpayer dollars and are lazy. Black Lives Matter is fake movement in order to achieve a victim status, and police brutality against Black Americans is usually warranted. So essentially what are they crying about? Don't do the crime if you don't want to do the time is the argument. Illegal immigration is allowed by liberal Democrats because they want these immigrants to vote for them. These are the narratives. Now, under this AltAmerica Tea Party movement comes the alt-right, the alternative right, and that's where white nationalism comes in. Now, white nationalism, really interesting about this phrase, white nationalism. On the face of it, the white part of this phrase does raise alarm bells because it sounds exclusionary, but nationalism, the word nationalism, as opposed to white supremacy, is intended to legitimize this movement. It is intended to give it a moral spin, because after all, who can blame anyone for being nationalist? It's not a crime to be a nationalist. Now, white nationalism, a lot of things come under here. I'm going to put groups as well as ideas: Oath Keepers, KKK, QAnon, Proud Boys, Three Percenters, Christian nationalists, ideas: anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia, anti-immigration, anti-internationalism, anti-same-sex marriage, anti-change, and white supremacy. And white genocide is a really interesting, narrative of alt-right. What it argues is that increased non-white immigration and an increase of the reproductive rate of, according to them, Blacks, Latinos, and other immigrants is diluting the demographics to become more non-white than white. And that is what they consider white genocide. So it's not an actual genocide. This is a metaphor. And this is a common theme in the narratives of Oath Keepers, Proud Boys, QAnon, Three Percenters, and so on and so forth. Now I'm going to look at, the last thing I'm going to look at here before I go into concluding remarks is the Islamic State movement and how I consider it a far right movement. Now, the aims of Islamic State are dominance and supremacy, not revenge and justice. This is important because this, I think, puts the Islamic State in the far right category. As other white supremacists. If you notice, the white supremacist narrative is never about justice or revenge. It's always about dominance and supremacy. Now, here are some of the aims, as we all are probably familiar with now: security, food, medical treatment, Sharia justice, faith, Islamic State intelligence agency, winning hearts and minds, which is ironic. How do you win hearts and minds with brutality? It's not really winning hearts and minds. You're basically just intimidating the populace, which is not the same thing. Punishing hypocrites, attacking enemies, and wanting to establish a transnational caliphate, extreme violence and brutality that is preemptive. Again, not about justice or revenge. Emphasis on law and order. Now, this again, to me, puts them on the far right. Emphasis on order, not equality, order. Now, methods are also interesting, which I think put them in the far right category. Now, Abu Bakr Najjar's treatise on management of savagery, I think is a very important element here in determining really what Islamic State is all about and how it's really far right. Now, these are some of the elements of the treatise on management of savagery. It argues that brutality is a repertoire and tool for domination and supremacy, unapologetically. Savagery is understood as developmental stage and state and nation building. So it's using a consequentialist logic. In other words, the ends justify the means, and the ends are order. So whatever it takes to get that order and the creation of the caliphate. So really, it's consequentialist morality, right? The ends are going to be good, just bear with us, essentially. Savagery as rite of passage. So in other words, in this treaty, what Najia is arguing is that recruits to Islamic State have to engage in savagery. It's a rite of passage. If you're too queasy about that, then you're not ready. Savagery is a necessary tool for gaining respect and recognition, which is a Machiavellian logic, because it's saying savagery to get respect and recognition, which is contrary to actually winning hearts and minds. Yes, you can get respect or through instilling fear, but it's really because the audience is silenced and terrorized. Managed savagery as moral order. Now, this is really interesting because it's a very Nazi-esque logic. Manage savagery as moral order. Now, just to give some contrast, here is brutality is both moral and necessary for dominance. Here's a quote, a Naji's quote. It says, acknowledging the natural revulsion most recruits, this is actually, I'm sorry, it's Tuan's analysis. Acknowledging the natural revulsion most recruits experience at the thought of extreme violence, they don't undertake it because they love killing. They are certainly not coarse people. In fact, they're tender, they have tender hearts. This is a logic forwarded by Abu Bakr Najjar Naji in saying that, all right, if you are repulsed by brutality, that makes you a good person. So now get over your repulsion and engage in brutality. What's striking to me about this, beyond the fact that savagery and brutality is considered a moral order, which is a very, again, dialectical logic, is that it's very reminiscent of Himmler's speech to his SS recruits and SS members. And this is a speech taken from Richard Rhodes' book. You can look that up. I find it really interesting. In this, Himmler says the following. He says, his speeches, were premised on relieving his men of whatever psychological stress they might feel at shooting unarmed victims, that they were only following orders, Himmler would tell his recruits, and any repugnance they felt was cause for congratulations, because it affirmed that they were civilized men and the victims were harmful and vermin. Now, this quote goes on and on, but what's interesting here is, again, the dialectical logic. Himmler is referring to his recruits, the SS, the brutal paramilitary Nazi entity. It's saying that repugnance makes you, later he goes on to say, not only civilized, but moral. So it says basically, because you're feeling repulsion, you're civilized. That's a good thing. Now go on and kill the Jews and the Gypsies. And if you feel repulsion, that's just a good thing. Just move past it. And I think this is very much a supremacist ideology that we also saw in the Islamic State. I can talk more about that in Q&A if you're interested. Now, finally, just to conclude, features common to all far right. Now, I want to just come back to the left-right spectrum and affiliated groups and movements in terms of my analysis. So you have all this that I've already mentioned before. So the left-leaning do not promote violence, but do not condemn it, either the same thing as right-leaning. And actively promotes violence, these things that you've already seen, revolution and totalitarianism. This then is norm eroding. The far left to liberal, you can argue, is norm eroding, and conservative to far right is norm preserving. Here we can put Al-Qaeda as far left. One of the reasons why I put Al-Qaeda far left and Islamic State and far right is that Al-Qaeda's narrative, bin Laden's narrative, was known for its, the narrative was about revenge, was about justice, was about wanting to be seen as equal, was about not being oppressed by the Western occupiers and the colonizers. And it was essentially saying, we are going to rise up and through violence, just so that you don't see us as impotent slaves. That's why I think it's put on the far left. It's violence, therefore far left, but it's not about supremacy. It was not about supremacy, although of course the spin-off of that Islamic State was. Antifa, Black Panther movement and Israeli Black Panther movement. Here, on the right-leaning far right, white nationalism, white supremacist movement, QAnon. Notice I've distinguished here, QAnon is right-leaning and KKK is far right. Oath keepers vary. They are both. Sovereign citizen movement, also both. Tea Party, as I mentioned, it's a party, Tea Party movement comprises of both conservative, all the way from conservative to far right. And these are comprises the AltAmerica and alt-right movement. Then you can also put Hilltop Youth. I can discuss that more in questions. Hilltop Youth is a Jewish Zionist extremist group that is also based on supremacy. And then you can put you can put Islamic State there. Now, last slide, contrasting far left and far right. Here's my rendition of this contrasts that build on the earlier arguments, but take it a little bit further. Far left looks for equal justice, far right, social hierarchy, far left, equal rights, far right, superiority. Far left looks at recognition as wanting recognition as different but equal. In other words, we may be ethnically, racially, or religiously different, but we're still equal. Far right looks at recognition as different and superior. We're not like the rest of them, we're better. Far left uses dialectical logic, and far right uses eugenics logic. Eugenics is essentially the view, was the practice of mating desirable individuals together in order to produce a more perfect human children. But eugenics was also the justifying logic of Nazi Germany. Far left, shared identity, focuses on shared identity defined as political, socioeconomic class, and far right considers shared identity as racial, ethnic, and religious. Finally, far left encourages violence, brutality as a necessary evil, therefore consequentialist logic, whereas far right uses violence, brutality, and savagery as natural order, and therefore Darwinian logic. All right, I'm going to end right there.
Thanks.
Over to you.
Thank you, Irm. That's a very fascinating and really enlightening presentation. Brought up a lot of interesting points for discussion. And in fact, the questions are flowing in. Right. In fact, the question which I had for you almost at the beginning, right, the top of my head is similar to what I believe one of the participants have brought in. In fact, it's the same question. I might as well ask this. There's a question about the categorization of Al-Qaeda as left-wing. It's a movement that asserts Muslims are superior. It calls for the glory of yesteryears and is totalitarian. Doesn't that make it kind of right-wing? You know? Yep.
Yeah, it doesn't. That does make it more far left. But if in my analysis of Al Qaeda, the beginning, the narratives in the beginning were more about justifying violence in terms of a reaction to brutality and oppression. So, and more to me, if you look at bin Laden's narratives, I mean, of course, it's splintered. And one of the most important splinters is what led to the creation of Islamic State. and so there were splinters within that. But if you look at the originating or original narratives, they were more about non, and I don't have the quotes right now to show you, but in many of the quotes, bin Laden is talking essentially using very dialectical logic, that we are not your slaves and we're going to use violence in order to reject your supremacy. And that's why I would, but of course that's open to discussion. It's not, that's just, I think some elements of Al-Qaeda could certainly be put in far left.
Okay, thanks. A question from our colleague Raf Patuji. Okay, he's saying that, is it your discussion really about totalitarians versus non-totalitarians rather than left and right? Isn't the distinction between the left and right also about capitalist versus socialist? So Raf being contrarian again. Is it really about totalitarians?
Capitalist versus socialist. So is he putting far right as capitalist and far left as socialist? Because I would disagree with that if that's the case. Far right is not capitalistic necessarily. It could be, but it's not necessarily. It is true that the far right elements in the United States want less government involvement in the economic sector, and they want more a sort of a natural order of things, for things to equalize and stabilize and come to an equilibrium on their own. So to that extent, yes, they are more capitalistic. But far right socialists, I mean, yes, I mean, it's not inaccurate, but I think there's more to it than that. It's not necessarily, that's a kind of, it's not wrong, but that's not all what the distinction is made. What was the earlier part of the question for Raf? Something about totalitarian and
basically totalitarian versus non-totalitarian rather than left versus right.
So non-totalitarian is, in my view, the far left is. I think there's a little bit of a. So in my view, totalitarian. When I think of totalitarian, I think far right. Why? Because totalitarianism is based on a notion of supremacy. Is based on a notion of not challenging the natural order, which, according to totalitarian entities, is, and here that's where I put Islamic State, is based on ascribed characteristics and a kind of a Darwinian logic. Nazi Germany, the same thing with that. Non-totalitarian, so totalitarian I would put in far right, and non-totalitarian far left. But then again, you have elements, Soviet, Stalin's regime was definitely totalitarian. But the defining logic was more leftist than right. So I don't think you can actually say that the distinction is just simply totalitarian versus non-totalitarian. All of those elements you do see in some examples.
Sure.
I'd be happy for Raf's counter question. I don't think I really addressed his question too well, but so Raf, if you want to.
There are other questions as well, so
sure.
Raf can type it in if he wants to.
Sure.
There's a good question about fascism, which is kind of something which I wanted to ask as well. But I'll keep it there because Paul Hedges has an interesting comment here, which perhaps I should just share with you. He says he's wondering how useful the left-right dynamic is for these groups, in particular with ISIS. Classifying them as far right ignores a strong anti-colonial dynamic, which was clear in their founding, where they videoed themselves knocking down a sand wall symbolizing the Sykes-Picot line. And much of what they are doing is also premised on resisting the way that Western powers have dominated the area. So the ISIS has an anti-colonial dynamic. Of course, Paul continues, as a caliphate, it has a broader rhetoric of domination, but this is not based upon any notion of racial supremacy or nationalism, but it's very different in terms of the Ummah, and so as an alternative to Western forms of governance. So his comment is, in his view, is that it seems a little simplistic to frame ISIS, as either left or right.
Mm.
So that's
Okay.
his
Yeah,
comment.
no, fair question. Thanks, Paul, for that. And thanks for attending, Paul. No, fair question, fair question. Yes, I do agree. Far left and right are sort of rigid categorizations. And that's why I think, yes, yeah, that's why they're problematic, because they're variations. So the notion that Paul mentioning that it is more, it started off more as a strong anti-colonial dynamic. Yes, of course, yes. So yes, Paul, that would not put it on far right. That would put it on the far left. That's true. But the caliphate notion is a notion of dominance, as you mentioned. So it's true that it's not premised on racial superiority, but it is based on the superiority of those who are Muslim. It's not about race, but it's about religion. And it's very clear in the narrative that, apostates are going to be beheaded, the infidels are going to be beheaded. So there is a supremacy implicit in the notion of the caliphate, and that is essentially, as of the historical caliphate, is that the Muslims are going to be the preferred citizens, a kind of a apartheid system, and the non-Muslims are, well, non-Muslims. So I see that as a notion of supremacy, not racial, not ethnic, but religious. Be interested to know what Paul says in counter to that.
Okay, so I think it's a fair comment and response. Uh, there's a question here from our colleague Ben Ang. From the last slide of your summary, do the descriptions on the far left look quite moderate and acceptable, since you cited Stalin and Al-Qaeda as examples of the far left? It's referring to the last slide. Since you cited Stalin and Al-Qaeda, do the descriptions on the far left look moderate and acceptable? Was that your intent?
Oh, not at all. I don't think I mentioned what's the
Stalin and Al-Qaeda as examples of the
I
far
don't
left.
think I mentioned Lenin at all. No, that's not my intent.
Stalin.
Who?
Stalin.
Oh, Stalin. No, it's not. It's not my. No, not at all. Not at all. I'm sorry if it came across that way. No, the idea I'm saying is that both are violent and therefore problematic and destabilizing. But their motivating rhetoric or narrative is different. So no, it's not that far left is better than, or less or more benign than far right. It's what I did mention is that far left, and particularly Antifa, it has a violent entity, and it is ruthless. It can be ruthless. It's not, so if you want to put it in colloquial terms, they're not nice people any more than far right, but the narrative is more appealing than white supremacists in that the narrative is more inclusionary. It's not distinguished by race, religion, ethnicity. It's premised on rejecting Nazism that is based on supremacy. So no, my intention was not to present in the concluding slide far left as somehow more benign, not at all. I'm just making the distinction between the features.
No problem. Question here about QAnon and Proud Boys. How to explain the Latino participation in QAnon and Proud Boys, considering the rhetoric of these groups? So there's the Latinos participating.
Well, you can also ask yourself, how come there were Muslim supporters of the Trump presidency or Black American supporters? So there are many ways to answer, to understand that. I think joining groups such as that, very macho, aggressive groups, offers ethnic and racial minorities a kind of a recognition. QAnon and Proud Boys are primarily, well, they're primarily anti-government, and they're based on a conspiracy theories, that doesn't in itself exclude ethnic and racial minorities, and that's one explanation. You can have grievances against the government, and Latino, I'm assuming the person is talking about American, but Latino in ethnicity, because you won't find foreigners or non-Americans joining that. But yes, I mean, if the premise of these groups, and it is, the premise is anti-government, then there's no reason, really, it's not that surprising that you would have non-white people joining that, because that's what they're holding on to. But as I mentioned, these groups sort of blend into others. So just because the main narrative is anti-government and based on, and anti-government is linked to conspiracy theories. So the government is doing this and government's doing that, the liberals are doing this, and this is, so one conspiracy theory builds on the other, but the bottom of the conspiracy theories is a distrust in the current government and actually the current system. Democratic liberal democracy, which increasingly, of course, is not so much liberal democracy, at least wasn't under Trump regime, sorry, Trump government, that was a slip. Apologies. Well, I mean, you know, let's face it, I mean, some of his executive orders were meant to bypass the Congress, and in that way they were undemocratic. But the intention, you know, if you look at, well, I think I'll stop here because I think I'm sidetracking here. But that's how it explains the non-white inclusion in Proud Boys and was the question Oath Keepers also? It was that the is it Oath Keepers?
No, QAnon and Proud Boys.
Oh yeah, and okay, yeah, and like I said, for example, Oath Keepers is primarily anti-government, but it's also engaged in Islamophobic violence and anti-gay. And QAnon, I mean, Proud Boys is homophobic. I think there's a complex, so if you were to ask a sociologist why, how does that explain? There are complex dynamics that explain the attraction to certain groups. Now, it may be the individuals that are joining want to be known also as anti-gay and Islam and homophobic, because perhaps because of their religious sentiments, and so that supersedes racial distinctions. That's how I would explain that. Of course, you would not find non-whites in the KKK or neo-Nazi groups. I think it can be explained by the actual premise of these groups, what they actually say they are about as justifying their existence. And these groups that you've mentioned are not about racism, not on the surface of it anyway. They're about distrust in government, and anyone can be distrustful in government. And incidentally, I'm linking this to Trump's administration because it's not a secret that Trump was a far right sympathizer. It's not a secret. In fact, what's interesting, I didn't mention this in the talk, is that white nationalism as a movement, the reason why it didn't really make front page news is because it lacked a leader, a cohesive leader. And then according to sympathizers of this movement, Trump became the leader. This is really interesting. This is based on research done by many scholars. Trump was actually seen by white nationalists as their leader in office. So, I mean, but yet you had Black Americans, you had Latino Americans, you had Indian Americans, not Native Indian, but Indian Americans and others supporting Trump vehemently. So how do you explain that? And I think there's a lot of complex dynamics. Maybe you support the entity because you feel, the individual feels that the Trump is anti-Muslim, he's anti-certain elements. As long as we're not those elements, then we can jump on the bandwagon as a kind of a desire for recognition. I think that's how I understand it, and that's how.
Actually, if I may link what you just said, Irm, a question just come in to asking you to comment on the process underway in the U.S. examining the January 6th storming of the Capitol building. So the question here is, how will this process affect, in your view, how will this process affect definitions and perceptions of the far right in the U.S.? Do you think that laying bare the events of January 6th will kind of reverse the trend which was kind of accelerated during the Trump administration, and this will result in such far right ideologies and groups being pushed back to the fringe rather than where they are in the mainstream of American politics?
No, quite the opposite, unfortunately. And the reason is that a lot of the groups that came, that were part of this, QAnon, Proud Boys, um, 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 among others. Some of them were right-leaning, not far-right. Some of them were conservative, and some of them were far-right. No, if the main narrative of those participants in January 2021 was the view that Biden's government is illegitimate, that the whole liberal democratic setup is illegitimate, and that Trump really won the election, but it was hijacked by the liberals and the moderates. If given that narrative, the prosecution of these individuals only feeds into that narrative, this paranoid conspiracy theory narrative, because then and in fact, I'm already seeing that those narratives from analysis that's coming out now, it feeds into it. It's about it essentially becomes, see, we knew it, this government is against us. Now it's arresting us. And related narrative is we have a freedom of action. We have a freedom of speech. What did we do so wrong? Which of course, it's obvious what they did wrong, the use of violence and the destruction of a government building. The other defining feature of these majority of the groups that comprised the riots in January 2021 was that they feel the emphasis on natural rights. The narrative is the emphasis on natural rights that above and beyond individual rights. And what that means is we don't need the government to secure our rights. These are rights that we are born with. These are inalienable rights. All we need is guns and our freedom, defined as essentially anarchical notion of freedom. We just want, we'll be fine, just back off the government. That's the view. So in any government policies intended to counter such rioting or counter such actions is taken as just an illustration of the oppressive government, that an illegitimate government that they have anyway. So I think the prosecution, I mean, it can deter, obviously it's going to deter some, but I think it's also going to inflame the narrative of others. It just feeds into it. That's the problem with conspiracy theories. They're so bizarre that one conspiracy theory feeds off of another and leads to another. There's no end to it. There's no end to any conspiracy theory. So yes, that's what I'm concerned about, whether it's going to just inflame these narratives and in fact lead to more consolidation of these groups. Just an example, very different, very it's a different example, but Mubarak, President Mubarak of Egypt, whenever he clamped down on the Islamic revivalist movement and members, and ones that were not violent, the more he clamped down, the more splinter groups were created in order to create that were violent. I mean, that doesn't mean to say that government should not do anything, but I think that there has to be more a public publicization of the wrongs that happened with reference to the Constitution, which is what the prosecutors are doing.
Right. There are kind of three questions which are kind of like related, so I'll just try and summarize them. When you apply these categories, right and left, right, to these groups, I mean, isn't there a possibility of some fluidity that, you have some hybrid categories? Mm-hmm. And for example, Paul came back to your comment and saying that, if you talk, for example, if you talk about seemingly left and right aspects of ISIS, it seems we need to prioritize some parts and so de-emphasize other parts of it to stick it into either camp. So is it possible for something to be both left and right in certain aspects, So ISIS could
Oh,
be left.
is that what, that's Paul's question,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, absolutely, Paul. Yes, absolutely. In fact, yeah, that's the problem with left and right spectrum. It's kind of a neat theoretical spectrum. I mean, how do you, life is not that way. But yeah, absolutely. I like what you said. Yeah, so, and as I mentioned, in my view, the supremacy that defined by religious affiliation. So anyone Muslim is good as long as they support Islamic State. If not, they get beheaded too. And so I do see that as a supremacist ideology. And of course, as you mentioned, the caliphate. But yes, and the other points that you mentioned do put it to the far left. So yes, I think that's fair. A more sophisticated understanding would see it as hybrid categories, that sometimes they shift from far left to far right, with the defining feature being the use of violence. But you can't say that to all, of course, right? The Antifa is absolutely in no way far right and will never be, because their whole raison d'etre was the rejection of fascism and Nazism. So it will always be very distinctly in the category of far left. But yeah, you can say, and I think the example of Israeli Black Panthers is a great example that illustrates Paul's point here, because it went from far left leaning to far left, to suddenly realizing they weren't getting the recognition that way. So they're just going to jump the bandwagon and go to the right leaning, and then ultimately far right Shah's party. I think it really is a wonderful illustration of how some entities are not so much committed to their ideology, but more committed to the desire to get recognition.
Right. Fair point. An interesting question here. Do you think that should we make a distinction when you talk about the right and the left between political ideology or economic policy? Would you agree with that if you try and make a distinction between political ideology or the far the left and the right, it's kind of different than if you like try to say you look at the economic policy that is kind of left as opposed to right-leaning economic policy. Do you think that's important?
Uh, hmm. So let me understand the question properly. Can we distinguish the far left and far right in terms of the support for economic policy?
Or it doesn't have to be far right or far left, but right wing as opposed to left wing.
Oh yeah, yes. I mean, yeah. I mean, so here coming back to Raf's point, yes, of course, there is that. I mean, that's the left and right spectrum that I mentioned earlier. Yeah, left and right is understood in terms of capitalism and socialism versus socialism, and then liberalism in the middle, undemocratic. But yes, of course, yes.
Yep, that's fine. I mean, you've touched on this already.
Mm.
Earlier on, there was a question which I wanted to come back to actually about fascism.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, can we see fascism as a form of ultranationalism, right? So, and how does ultranationalism differ from nationalism? I mean, this is a quite pertinent question because you see this term ultranationalism a lot in the policy discourse. So, do you think that fascism is a form of ultranationalism?
Absolutely, yes, absolutely, and incidentally, so was Nazism in Germany and neo-Nazi groups. Absolutely, yes. So let me answer that with this way: distinction between nationalism and ultranationalism, how I see it, based on my own analysis of others as well, is that the ultranationalism implies exclusion. It implies an unbridled, unapologetic exclusion of the other. And the other, who is the other, that's defined by what the particular nationalist movement is defining nationalism as being based on. For white nationalists, the other is all non-white individuals. They can be American, they can be born American, naturalized American, but they're non-white, so they're not part of the nationalist movement. Now, in some other countries, like if you look at the genocide in Rwanda, the nationalistic, ultra-nationalistic sentiments were not based on race. They were based on ethnic and religious, ethnic affiliations. And so what nationalism, how nationalism is defined varies, but however it's defined, the ultra-nationalism implies exclusion. It implies hostility. There was a related question to that. Kumar, can you read the related question to that ultra-nationalism part?
Oh, I was going to ask about this as well, but I think that was essentially it about fascism. I mean,
Yes, because interestingly, fascism, to the extent that it's exclusionary, it's based on a supremacist ideology, and of course neo-Nazism. The nationalism, the reason why, as I mentioned, white nationalism, the word nationalism is used as a legitimizing narrative. And a cloak for essentially what is white supremacists and neo-Nazis. And so it sort of hides their real intention. But under the fact, and again, the sovereign citizen movement in the United States, on the surface of it, what they're saying is, hey, what are we saying so wrong? All we want is the integrity of the country. And we don't want illegal immigrants. And so that is something that most people can actually agree with. Nobody wants illegal immigrants, but it goes deeper. That's just a cloak for what the real intentions are. So yeah, that's how I would define ultra-nationalism. Ultra-nationalism goes further to the right, because it becomes exclusionary and becomes about promoting violence.
Right. Another question I wanted to fit in here, because a fair bit of questions here. I mean, U.S. Political scientists Norman Podhoretz, Francis Fukuyama, and some other European scholars have used the term Islamofascism to describe the likes of ISIS and, for that matter, Al-Qaeda. I've always wondered about how useful such a term is, and in fact, this term has appeared in the U.S. policy discourse as well in the 2000s, right? I mean, after listening to you this afternoon, I think I can understand why the term fascism has been used in this way. But how would you think about that? I mean, it's a useful term.
That's interesting. That's interesting, because I remember being troubled by that term in the days of Al-Qaeda's prominence. At the time, I and other scholars saw the reference Islamophobia as as a way to delegitimize an entity that essentially grew as a reaction to American or Western domination, wars, occupations. And I've always said that, regardless of what the far right or far left entity is, even white supremacists, it's important to understand what they're saying as their grievances, because their grievances, the government in question needs to address or appear like they're addressing the grievances and not just demonizing them. It's easy to demonize when they use violence, particularly when they're neo-Nazi. But there is a grievance that it resonates with the populace, and that's why they are still in existence and they get consolidated. So I think that initially my view of Islamofascism was that it denies the culpability of actors outside of the Muslim world in creating these violent entities, which were, at least in their rhetoric, rejection of occupations and oppression. But I think when it comes to Islamic State and its narrative of the caliphate and its extreme brutality and brutality as a repertoire that they wanted to very much advertise, the big occasion they made of beheadings, and the exclusion of the derogatory reference to non-Muslims. I think suddenly now Islamofascism doesn't seem so inaccurate in the context of Islamic State, in my view. Fascism, if by that is meant exclusionary politics, meant extreme tools to to justify the ends that are sought. So yeah, it's a problematic, but sometimes, but I think my view on that has changed in light of the Islamic State
Mm.
entity. I think it may actually be quite well appropriate.
Sure. Yep. There's a question here about Asians identifying with elements of the far right repertoire.
Mm.
Uh, yeah. So I mean, this kind of like raises the other issue, which is related here. There are scholars, for example, Jason Stanley, who talks about fascism, and he uses fascism as a term to sort of describe not just the white supremacists, but also the Hindu and the Buddhist extremists as well. So white supremacists, Hindu and Buddhist extremists, he says they are all fascists,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, and so this kind of ties in with Omar's question here about how some Asians seem to identify with elements of the far right. I mean, do you have any thoughts about this?
Well, I think that's accurate. I mean, I didn't mention, I didn't touch upon Buddhist extremism or Hindu extremism. But yes, to the extent that they're based again on an exclusionary ideology, and they're in this case, it's I would say more religio-fascism, if we can say that. It's based, the justifying narrative is religion and what religion, using religion as ideology. So yes, absolutely. And I think that's important. That's why I think when we look at Islamofascism, the term, I think we need to be open to the reality of that. But then at the same time, I think the problematic aspect of that term is that it seems to exclude Islamist extremism as somehow distinctly threatening. And I think that's wrong, because Buddhist extremism and Hindu extremism is equally threatening. So if we're going to say Islamofascism, we should also say Hindu fascism or Buddhist fascism. And because let's call it for what it is. These are exclusionary movements. And yeah, so yeah, fascism is a defining term. It's not, it's not related to any one entity.
Sure.
The ideology of supremacy and exclusion, that's really what we need to look at. Which of the entities are basing that? Buddhist extremists in Myanmar, definitely. The ideology of superior race as opposed to inferior. Hindu extremists, the same thing. Now, Islamic State, not so much overtly, but in implication of their policies and rejection of the other.
Right. There's a question here. I don't know whether you want to have a comment about this. Do you think the rapid rise of the big tech companies has allowed far-right extremists to build ecosystems to mainstream their sentiments? I mean, you want to have a comment about that? The role of big social media companies. Uh,
Uh, yeah, sorry, what about big social media companies?
do you think the big tech companies have enabled well, not enabled, but allowed far-right extremists to build ecosystems to mainstream their sentiments? Actually, it's quite a
Hmm.
relevant issue as well about
Yeah,
role of the
I think
social.
this is related to the argument that Facebook or Twitter
That's right.
should not allow the charters of these extremist groups to be uploaded. Um, I- you know, this is a tricky question, because if you block these individuals, they're going to find other venues. I mean, Trump found another venue. Some of the vicious far right in the United States find other venues. Then there's, of course, the dark web, where you get all this, and these individuals know how to go there. So I don't know if blocking their literature really addresses the problem. I mean, it is true that it creates an easy way for these groups to recruit, but it also, I think it can also work the other way, that can make them feel that they're being oppressed. If the narrative is that they're being oppressed, this just feeds into that narrative. I mean, Trump's narrative was that the liberals and the left were against him, and he's the rightful American president. Being ousted from Facebook and Twitter only inflamed that rhetoric. And so I think there's a fine line. I think certainly some objectionable posts, such as um, well, you know, really violent posts should be taken off, because there is, you know, social media can seem as if it's promoting that. But I don't know, it's a tricky question. I mean, taking off or banning the charters or treaties of these or declarations or what have you, banning them from social media doesn't mean you can't find them elsewhere.
Right.
It just, I think, feeds into their conspiratorial narrative that the world is against them, or at least some of the world, the left world. And banning these material from social media doesn't reduce their recruitment. The recruitment is based on their perceived grievances. Just because Facebook and Twitter does not allow this doesn't mean the grievances go away. I think they actually just feed into the narratives. But again, it's a fine line. It's a fine line. Social media cannot be seen as promoting, for example, pedophile videos. Absolutely should be taken down. There is something grotesque about that, as well as videos of beheadings, and you could still get it elsewhere. So I'm not sure how to answer that. I have mixed views on that, of how effective that is. I think addressing grievances and having a counter narrative is more important than cutting off.
Yep, I think that's a very good policy relevant comment in terms of what to do about the spread of such extremist narratives on the far right, or any extremist narrative for that matter. I'm mindful of time, and essentially, I think we should wrap this up. We've had an excellent discussion. There's a very relevant, practical last question. What is the name of your upcoming book, so the audience can keep an eye on it, keep an eye out for it?
Okay, so it's Contradictions of Freedom, and it's going to be published by Routledge. And yeah, Contradictions of Freedom, yes.
Also free publicity for your new upcoming project, Irm. So anyway, thanks Irm for engaging with all of us this afternoon. We've had a very long and interesting discussion. As you can see from the screen, a lot of people have come in with comments and questions. So certainly, I would say both this webinar plus the first webinar on social movements itself have been provided much food for thought for everybody. So thank you very much. And thanks to the audience for your patience. Tried to go through it, all the questions, but it's kind of difficult. There's so many questions and not exactly that much time. But thank you for your participation, and I hope to see you at the next ICPVTR webinar as well. So with that, thank you very much, and have a good evening. So thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, everyone.